First, let's start by talking about what a deployment is. Basically, a deployment is a server-based image of a product's installation files. This is an image that you have named and is customized to your environment. And you create this using a similar interface as the standard installer. In fact, you will run the normal product installer in order to create a deployment. So what will happen is you will start with a product, and then you will create a deployment out to a network location, and then you'll use that deployment to install to multiple computers. So why would you create a deployment? Well, a deployment is a very efficient way to get a product installed onto multiple computers. You can create a deployment for standalone, multi-seat standalone, and network license types. Having a server-based image avoids the need to distribute DVDs for installation. So this saves you from walking around from machine to machine with the DVDs and installing the product over and over again. It also allows you to standardize your installation for all the workstations. So you can customize the installation one time, and you can unify the product registration information and include all the available service packs for that product. You can do all of this in one operation, and then when you deploy it to multiple machines, all of this work has been done. There are also a couple of logging options that allow you to track the installation status. The log files provide you a way of knowing whether or not there were problems when a user tried to install from a deployment. And a deployment is also an easy way to do a silent installation of a product. When you create a deployment that runs in silent mode and the user launches that on his machine, it runs unattended and doesn't require any interaction from the user. Now let's look at a high-level view of the deployment process. The first thing you should do is read the documentation. There's a lot of information about how to create a deployment, what the options mean, different ways of pushing a deployment to various user workstations. So review the documentation. Most of the questions that we get asked in product support are already answered by the documentation you already have. The next thing you want to do is create a network share. This is a location on a network where the administrative image is going to be stored. Once a deployment has been created, users will access this location in order to run the installer. Then you'll run the product installer and choose the Create Deployments option, and then you'll run through the steps of creating the deployment. Once the deployment has been created, you'll have an administrative image that contains all of the product files, and you'll also have MST files, which are the individual files that will be run when a user runs that deployment. Once that's done, you want to run the deployment at a single workstation first, and then verify that that installation is good before installing to other workstations. This is a very important step. The worst thing you can do is create a deployment and install it on 100 systems, only to later find out that you made a mistake and need to start over. Before I actually show you how to create a deployment, let's look at some best practices for creating deployments. Create the deployment from a workstation instead of from a server. This helps eliminate the need for the same computer to run the installation wizard, read the media, and write the files. A combination of these tasks can increase the time it's necessary to create the deployment and can cause corruption in the deployment. So create the deployment to a shared network location from an administrative workstation. Do not create deployments over a wide area network or a VPN connection. Connections over a WAN or VPN are typically slow and can cause errors during deployment creation. The deployment creation process may not be completed successfully, or some files could end up missing or corrupt. While not always necessary, a good practice is to copy the media to a hard drive. If you're working with physical media as opposed to media that you obtain through electronic fulfillment, copying the entire contents of the product media to a hard drive can speed up the process of creating a deployment and reduce the potential for corruption. This is even more important when you consider that some product installers copy the data from the installation media to the destination folder multiple times, thus increasing the deployment creation time by a factor of 3 or more. Copying the product media to a hard drive helps ensure that there are no communication issues with the disk drive and increases the speed of creating a deployment by not having to read the data directly from the DVD. Before you start, disable any antivirus software. Antivirus software often causes problems when creating deployments. Active virus scans that check every file that are being written or read, can cause the process to take much longer. Additionally, antivirus software can block certain files from being written or can modify those files and introduce corruption. Before creating a deployment, create a shared directory where the administrative image will live. Keep the share name simple and short, don't include any spaces in the share name, and don't bury the share directory too deeply on a drive. If you'll be creating multiple deployments, you want to keep each deployment image in a separate folder. Creating multiple deployments in a single folder can result in a corrupt installation and other problems. Create and store your deployment images on FAT, FAT32, or NTFS file systems only. Other file systems like DFS, NFS, AIX, etc. are not tested or supported by Autodesk. Verify that all the CAD users have read-write access to the network share where your deployments are located. They're going to need to access this location in order to run the deployment, and depending on where you put the log files, they may need to be able to write back to that location as well. Use a uniform naming convention instead of mapped drives. Not all computers share the same map drive letters, and restricting yourself to UNC paths will help avoid problems later. Be aware of the deployment type that you're creating. The default deployment license type is standalone, and you need to pick the configure button in order to change that to network. So if you're not paying attention and you just take the defaults, you may not end up with what you expect. Make sure you choose the appropriate operating system for your deployment. The first page of the deployment wizard offers an option to choose whether you're creating a 32-bit or 64-bit deployment. This allows you to create a deployment for a specific OS type regardless of the platform in use. This option will default to the type of operating system currently in use, but that may not be appropriate for client computers on which the deployment will later be run. If you're creating the deployment on a 64-bit operating system, but your client computers are all running 32-bit, you need to make sure and choose the option to create a 32-bit deployment instead. Pay close attention to the informational links in the sidebar of the deployment wizard. These links will change from one page to the next and can provide quick answers to the most commonly asked questions about deployment options on each page. Avoid modifying an existing deployment once it's been used to install a program. Instead, create a new deployment for each modification that you make. For example, if you are adding profiles or service packs and so on. Once they've been created, avoid moving deployments between servers. If you must do so, you will at minimum need to modify that deployment to insert its current location into the deployment structure. And again, install to one workstation first and then verify it before installing anywhere else. Taking the time to verify that one installation is good can save you a lot of time in the future. All right, let's walk through the process of creating a deployment. Here I've started the installer for AutoCAD 2011. This is the same installer that you would use if you were installing the product. So you'd launch this by putting in the DVD media in your machine or by navigating to wherever the product media is and running the setup.exe file. I'll begin creating a deployment by choosing the Create Deployments option. The first thing you want to do is specify the location for this deployment's administrative image. Recommend you keep all deployments in a uniquely named folder so that you can keep them separate from each other and you know what that deployment is for. This should be a shared folder on the network, and this is where the product deployment will be stored. In order to create your deployment here, you're going to need to have full control permissions for this folder. Next, you're going to specify the deployment name. I recommend that you give this name something unique and something that identifies it. So in this case, I'm going to be creating a network deployment of AutoCAD 2011, and so I've named it accordingly. Finally, you need to choose whether this is going to be a 32-bit deployment or a 64-bit deployment. As I said earlier, this is an important distinction to make. You can be on a 64-bit machine, and this option will default to 64-bit. But if what you need to create are 32-bit deployments, then you need to make sure that you select the 32-bit option. Now you select the products that you want to include in the deployment. The list of available products will be shown here, and this list may vary depending on what product you're creating a deployment for. So AutoCAD 2011 is already checked, and I'll include the medium image material library as well. Then you need to review and accept the software license agreement. And then enter your user and product information. Enter your serial number and product key, and press Next. On this screen, you'll specify some general deployment settings. By default, it selects the option to create a network log, and it pre-fills the log file location under the deployment folder that you specified earlier. The network log keeps a record of all the workstations that run the deployment. The log lists username, workstation name, and the status of the installation. This is a file that you would refer to for status information or details about problems that users may have encountered during installation. Because this log file needs to be written to when the deployment is running, the folder where the network log resides must be a shared folder, and users who install the program need to at least have change permissions. Without that, the deployment won't be able to accurately write information to the log file. The next option is to create a client log. This contains detailed information for each workstation and could also be useful for diagnosing installation problems. And the client log is created in the temp directory for each of the client workstations. The last option is to choose whether or not the deployment will run in silent mode. When this option is selected and a user starts a deployment, the installation runs without any user interaction. Users can't change any of the installation settings, and there's no dialog boxes that are presented during the installation. Also note that when a deployment is installed using silent mode, the user system will reboot automatically. Now, if I were to choose to create a deployment at this point, I would be using default values, and this is not what I want. What I want to create is a network license version of this deployment, and what its default value is a standalone license. So to change that, I need to choose Configure. And from here, I'll choose Network License. This is where you'll specify the license server model that you're going to use, and you'll enter the host name of the servers. For my purposes, I'm going to do a single license server, and I will enter the host name of that server. This screen is basically the same one you would see if you were doing a regular installation. You can either take the typical setting, or you can choose custom to add or remove features that you may want to include or may want to exclude from the installation. I'll just leave it as typical. Choose Next. The next option is unique to AutoCAD and doesn't appear in any other products. This gives you more granular control over where the support content folders are installed. Let me give a little background on this. In 2004, we adopted Windows XP logo compliance rules for user profile data. And this imposed some strict limitations on where support content data could be stored, and it resulted in the default storage of all support content in the local user profiles. Changing these options can help avoid the secondary installer that runs and copies the user data cache files into the new user profile. I'll say up front that this option is not for everyone, so be aware of what it does and how it impacts your users before you start changing things here. The default option is the local user profile folders. This is the same location as releases prior to 2010 when this feature was first introduced. The next option is the Program Install folder. With this option, all support content is installed to the AutoCAD installation folder on an individual user's workstation. Be aware of how this option will affect user rights. Users may need power user privileges to run AutoCAD on a system where support content is installed into the Program Install folder. The next option is a single shared folder. This allows you to specify a unique network location for all content types and subfolders for content types. By default, when a deployment is run on an individual workstation, the content is copied into that network location. But it only happens once unless you choose the option to overwrite existing files in shared network folders. The last option is custom folders. This option gives you full control over where each part of the content gets located. For each of the 6 content types listed here, you can specify a unique folder. Again, I would research this a little bit more before you use it. read the documentation that we've provided, and just be aware of how these settings will affect your users. For my purposes, I'm just going to set it back to the default and hit next. From this screen, you can modify the default search paths and the location of some program files. You might want to do this if your environment uses a file other than the default files that come with the program. Using these options, you can then point to those files and add them into the deployment up front and avoid having to add it individually to each workstation. From this screen, you can specify additional files that you want to include with a deployment. By default, these files get installed in the program's installation directory on the client workstations when the deployment is run. These additional files could be things like drawing files or Autolisp files or script files. Basically anything that you want to include with your deployment. Here you can specify some user preferences. Whether or not you want to see the welcome screen that first comes up, requiring Internet Explorer, and whether or not to set DWFX as a default publishing format. You can also specify a default profile name. If you don't want to use unnamed profile, you can put in another profile name and that will become the default profile name for the installations on the different workstations. You can choose whether or not to create a desktop shortcut, and you can specify custom desktop shortcuts that you may want created on each workstation. Custom desktop shortcuts use command line switches to specify different options when you start the program. For example, you can use command line switches to run a script when the program launches, or to start with a certain template or go to a certain view. I won't take the time to detail all of the command line switches that are available, but you can look at the help reference and find out more information about that. This screen allows you to include any available service packs for the product that you're installing. If there was a service pack available, then it would be listed up above. If you had downloaded a service pack to your local drive or to a network share, you could choose to include that from here and then just go add that service pack to the list. Or the option is not to include a service pack at all. If you were including a service pack, you have two options: to either append the service pack or merge the service pack. When you append a service pack, the service pack is applied to the current deployment only. And when you run a deployment with appended service packs, the deployment installs first, and then the service packs are installed as a separate operation afterwards. So this can make the installation process take a little bit longer on each client computer, but it's easier to modify later. When you merge a service pack, the service pack is merged into the administrative image. And once it's merged, a service pack cannot be removed from the administrative image. If you need to remove a service pack, then you have to recreate the admin image. There are no service packs available, so choose Next. This screen lets you specify whether or not to allow users access to the latest information and product discussions and live updates from Autodesk. You can choose to enable or disable live updates, whether or not to include the different information channels that send information. Those are usually discussion groups and new knowledge base content, things like that. You can set up a CAD Manager channel, which lets you provide a specific feed for your users. And then you can choose whether or not to enable RSS feeds or whether or not to allow a user to add RSS feeds. So it gives you some control over how much information is coming into your users. And this is where you configure whether or not users have access to online tools. For example, Design Center Online, or allowing access to the Subscription Center. If your product is on subscription, I recommend you leave this checked. When new updates are released for your product, that information will be sent through the Subscription Center and you'll get an automatic notification. Here you can choose whether to use online help from the Autodesk website or whether you want the help to be pulled locally. The default is to pull help from the Autodesk website, but if you're going to be deploying to machines that may not always have an internet connection, you could uncheck this and then all of the help will be pulled from the local installation. These options control our customer error reporting. CER is very important to Autodesk. When you experience a crash and you get a dialog that's asking you for information, that information is sent back to Autodesk and analyzed by developers to try and figure out what happened. And we use that information to figure out what defects need to be fixed or what improvements need to be made in the future. If this option is checked, it means your users are allowed to receive notifications when there's been a resolution to a problem. And then with this option checked, it just means that the computer name will be included in any error reports that are sent out. If you have multiple error reports that are coming from the same company, having the computer name in there helps us differentiate from one machine to the next. And this option decides whether or not users are allowed to customize the search locations in the info center. And now my configuration is complete. I'll choose Configuration Complete. And now I have my final screen where I can review all of the settings that I put in here, make sure that everything is as I expected. And once I'm happy with that, I just choose Create Deployment. And now the installer runs and begins creating the deployment. Once it's finished, you'll get a confirmation screen indicating that the deployment has been created, and directing you to the link you would use to install from this deployment, as well as a link to modify the deployment. At this point, you can also register the products online directly from this page. This is a good time to do this, especially if you're registering a multi-seat standalone installation. Now I've navigated to the shortcut that was created to install this deployment on the server, and I could launch this shortcut in order to begin the installation.